Well, this is the last week, and we've got two chapters again, but they're shorter chapters, which is nice. So let's move on here. And what we're looking at in these two chapters is how we actually make this all happen. Everything we've talked about previously. So, the title of chapter 11, which we're going to do today, now, excuse me, is transitioning to the just society. So, moving into it, moving from where we are into a truly just society. So, how do we move environmental movements forward? How do we make that a priority and a reality as well? Because we've talked about all the intellectual and philosophical aspects of them, from the conceptions and connections and contestations, all those con words that we talked about. Um, Now we need a fourth, way of thinking about this, the practical ecological one, a practical ecological construction of a different reality. So, once again, a social construction of reality, but this one that goes beyond talking, basically, and starting to do and to act and to construct, to build a more ecological society. And as Karl Marx said, this quote's in your book, and it's a great one. Philosophers have so far only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it, right? Particularly when you know everyone's life, everything's life, and the planet's on the line. And then the point is really to change it and not just talk about it or think about it. So how do we get from there to here? I mean, you could impose behaviors if you lived in a fascist, totalitarian or either direction totalitarian state. You could just impose behaviors and make all kinds of rules and laws about it. But as we know from history, that doesn't work very well. People definitely resist that, being told and forced to what to do and forced to do certain things. So, and it's not a just way of doing it either, is it? To impose those things. So, what we need is an ecological society that's also just. It's a just society. And the way to get that is through a process that includes everybody. It includes, all voices, right? Listening to all voices. Once again, a dialogue. But there's always a but. Having a voice and being listened to requires power of some form or another. And this is where we're going to talk a lot about participatory democracy here as we move on, because it's the only power we've got. It's a huge amount of power in a democracy, but that's it. So that is how it works. People will be listened to, right? If they do various things to participate. The biggest, hugest one is voting. Okay, but there are many other ways, as we've talked about with social movements and a variety of other things. So that means if it requires power to have a voice, some form of power to have a voice, it means that this dialogue requires some kind of governance, which we relate to government, because what a government does is govern, and that is governance, right? And the reason you need that, the reason you need laws and rules and regulations of some form or another, is to make sure that it doesn't break down into just arguments, right? I'm sure you've been to many meetings or some meetings where it just breaks down into total argument because there's really no dynamic for making sure that everyone's heard and it doesn't, just become a shouting match. And what happens in situations like that is those with less power don't get to speak. Their voices don't get heard because the people who feel entitled to, be the loudest or bang the gavel, you know, take over. and it eliminates people who feel that they have less power and actually do to participate. So the key point in governance is that it requires participation if it's to be democratic. Oy, it's a gosh, it's such a feedback loop. If you want good governance, good laws, good rules, etc., you have to participate to help create those. Otherwise, the people who are not don't have any there's no checks or balances. Otherwise, the people in power can do whatever they want if the people don't participate in how their governance looks, what it's made of. So the engine of democracy requires a lot of parts to it in order to be fair and effective, those checks and balances I just mentioned. So citizens require information, right? To make decisions, to vote, and to participate, and to have a sense that their participation matters. And this is something that is, man, it is so difficult to get across to people how important each individual person's participation matters, because once again, it's Gandhi's statement that nothing you do as an individual matters. It's a collective of individuals acting that makes the change. Okay. So these three bulleted points. So governance requires participation if it's to be democratic. Okay. The first was we just talked about. The engine of democracy requires lots of parts and pieces in order to be effective of those checks and balances. And second, citizens need information in order to participate, to make decisions, to vote, and to have a sense that their participation matters. And then the third is to understand, not have this total resistance to bureaucratic rules, because what those bureaucratic rules do, if they're productive ones, is to protect those rights, to enforce laws, to deliver services. We're going to look at that a little bit more, how those things work in this. But I want to go back to the second point here for a moment, which says the opening phrase of that second point about participation is citizens require information to make decisions. This used to be so much easier. You'll have to trust me on this. I'm so much older than all of you. Before social media and before, the whole dynamic from the 1984 George Orwell book, you know, lies are truth, truth are lies, kind of statements. War is peace, peace is war. All of those kind of totally weird statements that were made in that book by an authoritarian government. It was much easier to tell what was real information, what was valid information, what was truth, not relative truth, but truth. And that's much more difficult now. And that's one of the things that's led us to the situation that we're in today, is that, yes, citizens do require information in order to participate, but what they require is valid information. Okay, so those 3 points we just made means that the bureaucrats and politicians not only have power, but they also have position, or what we've talked about as face. They have, they're in the game, right? They have position. And of course, if you have a position, and it's a position that you like, that has power and authority associated with it, you want to protect that position. Okay? So that is another aspect of this, and we see that is so in our face today, of people doing whatever it needs to be done in order, politicians in particular, in order to protect their positions of power. And that position, unfortunately, often becomes more important than the actual purpose of their jobs, which you know, it's so interesting teaching this right now with everything that's going on because it's so apropos of everything that's happening, really. Okay. So we got lots of examples of that today. And what we're going to do right now is begin with what a democratic state is, and the difference and the feedback loop again between democracy and the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy mainly uh, has to do with rules, or laws, etc., those types of things. How does democracy and bureaucracy, how do they interrelate with each other? And how do they benefit and support each other is another aspect of it. Now, we're going to look at what Alexis de Tocqueville said, because he was a very bright young Frenchman who was interested in this experiment in America called democracy. And so in 1831, he I think he was 26, as I recall, something like that. He was an aristocrat who survived the terror times of the shift from royalty and the killing of so much of the aristocracy in France. This was after that happened a bit in 1831, but he came from an aristocratic family, and he decided to come to America to see what was going on here. And he spent 2 years traveling around America and investigating this, as your book puts it, new experiment in democracy. And he wrote one of the most important sociological works of all time. It's still taught everywhere and read, and it's called Democracy in America. That was what he wrote after his 2 year sojourn here. And remember, this was 1831, so it was not that long after we became an independent country and set up our own form of democracy and system of government. He was kind of conflicted about, he wasn't kind of, he was conflicted about what he observed in the United States in relation to this young democracy just beginning to take off. Because he said, yeah, it's true that if you eliminate these ties of bonds of the aristocracy that people had lived under for so long, and we're here referring to the absolute power of monarchs and things of that nature. If you eliminated those ties with aristocracy, well, yes, that's true. It facilitated the freedom of individual thought, and it reduced the concentration of property that was plaguing Europe. So it allowed people to have freer thoughts safely and express them. Democracy did, as opposed to royal monarchy. And it also loosened up all that property, that real property, like real estate, that was locked up in the aristocracy. So the aristocracy, like everybody, um, it links everyone. An aristocracy links everyone. Everyone has to be loyal to the monarch. Everyone operates within a very tight system in an aristocracy, right? And democracy, from de Tocqueville's viewpoint, loosens those links. People aren't completely tied to a democracy, and they have a choice in the kind of government that they have, and also who is in charge of that government. But loosening the links, he thought, wasn't all for the best, because it created some negative aspects from his viewpoint as well. And I think that when you see what they are, we can agree that they are not so great. Some of the other things that were side effects of getting rid of a monarchy or an aristocracy where everyone was linked in a common situation. So what he said was that the individual's passion for equality and democracy turns to delirium. Well, I think we're seeing that today as well. the delirium about uh, my freedom and control and nobody's going to control me, which means nobody's going to make any rules about anything, basically. And that's what he saw when he said turns to deliver him. And what that does is it potentially leads citizens to overestimate their own knowledge, okay, and to gradually become self-absorbed, isolated, and even egotistical. Well, he was very prescient in what he saw was the potential could happen in a, I would say, in a pseudo-democratic system, really. At the time he was watching this, he was seeing what the negative effects might be down the road. And he said, in a situation where everybody's so individualistic, the ancestors are forgotten. And individuals view themselves as owing nothing to no one. Now, this definitely relates to the environment, right? I don't know anything to anyone. I can do whatever I want myself, and I certainly don't owe anything to the planet or to the other entities on it, okay? And what he called this idea of owing nothing to anyone, okay, looking out for number one exclusively, he coined the term individualism. There was no such word before de Tocqueville wandered around America for 2 years and saw this phenomenon of people only caring about themselves for the most part and not the community very much, certainly nothing else. And so he created this term individualism. And his definition of individualism is a feeling which dispossesses each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellows and to withdraw into the circle of family and friends, with little society formed to his taste. He gladly leaves the greater society to look out for himself. So, yes, that's exactly what's happened to a lot of people in America. I just said a minute ago, looking out for number one. So, and disconnecting from, then here's the flip side of that again. Disconnecting from community can certainly have its benefits as well. It all depends, right? It depends on the community you're disconnecting from. It depends on what you're moving towards. So some of those benefits could be that rather than the entrenched hierarchies and obligations of an aristocracy or a monarchy, that citizens can become empowered and pursue self-exploration. It's true. However, breaking the ties of ancestry and other types of community can also lead to a lack of concern for one another and the social and ecological contexts we share. Okay, we all may be very different, but we do share certain social contexts, and we certainly all share ecological and environmental contexts, right? And isn't it interesting that he saw the lack of connection to ancestry in 1831 as a potential in this system that we have, and now there's this huge flowering of interest in ancestry.com, where people are really exploring that again. And so de Tocqueville saw that in the very roots of equality, which were meant to cultivate freedom, the threat of indifference can grow. The flip side of freedom and equality can be indifference. Okay? Because as people become more individualistic and more focused on their own personal needs, here's the key point. The government that they were meant to rule over can wind up ruling them. Why? Because they don't participate. The only way a democracy can work is with almost full participation of the people that the government is meant to control or make laws for or rules for. We have the lowest voting participation rate of any industrialized nation and some non-industrialized nations. Check it out. Go check out the voting participation rate in India, for instance, places like that. And then certainly look at Europe and see what you find, in Canada and places like that. What did Tocqueville, I'm going to repeat that. As people become more individualistic, more focused on their own personal needs, the government that they were meant to rule over can wind up ruling them because they don't participate. Okay? De Tocqueville called this administrative despotism, resulting from the gradual, progressive disengagement of people from democracy, from the process of democracy. He warned that this would result in low participation even in the most basic of democratic acts, voting. Isn't that amazing? He wrote this in 1831, and he was able to have this long view of seeing what the potential, the negative, the downside of democracy could be if people turned a certain corner, right, of total individualism and concern for self. And for those who do not vote, and for those who do vote, they often believe that just voting is the fulfilling of their only obligation in public life. This is de Tocqueville again. Okay, so even for people who do vote, they think, well, I did my bit, I voted. That's it, I'm done. I'm not paying any more attention, right, to what's going on. But he strenuously pointed out that a democratic political endeavor cannot and must not stop with the occasional act of casting a ballot. And it is an occasional act, isn't it? Okay. And for many people who do vote, it's about the only time they really think about that kind, participating in the system, in the democratic system. Now, he was very obviously, you might say he was a prophet in a sense, to see where we're at today from looking at it those many years ago. But Max Weber, who came after de Tocqueville, also shared de Tocqueville's concerns about growing bureaucratic authority. Weber warned of what he called passive democratization and the substitution of the bureaucratic machine. These are his terms. Passive democratization. Oh, we're all little sheep and we don't, we're too involved with ourselves to actually participate. So that was passive democratization. We might vote. Well, here's an example. The voting rate at presidential elections is so much higher than in midterm elections. And that's nuts if you think about the Congress and the Senate and how crucial those midterm elections are at actually getting anything passed, right? In terms of legislation. Okay. So Weber warned about passive democratization and the substitution of the bureaucratic machine for true participatory democracy. Okay. But the good news is that with a watchful and mindful citizenry, which we don't have today for the most part, but with one, if we all could get, or the vast majority of us could get watchful and mindful, and learn where to find accurate and true information, then the bureaucratic machine can be held in check, Weber said. Can be. So how do we do all of that stuff? It may sound overwhelming, and sometimes I worry we've gone too far down the road in the other direction, but I don't think so. Things happen that energize people and motivate people to get involved, and we're seeing some of that happening right now. So one of the simplest ways to reconnect to community and democracy is through what de Tocqueville called habits of the heart. Isn't that nice? And what he meant by that was uh, the customs of the moral and intellectual values of a people. So let's get back to ecology. If ecology becomes a custom of moral value, for example, then people will join associations, they'll vote, they'll take personal actions to protect the environment. Plus, another aspect of this is that the bureaucrats have habits of the heart too. We all do, right? We all have habits of the heart that involve our interests and our feelings and our sentiments, etc., our beliefs, values. So it makes the job easier for bureaucrats if they can point to citizen interest and citizen pressure to move the machine in a different direction. They can say, well, all my constituents support da da da. So I'm going to vote that way because that's what my constituents want. And that's what I was elected to do, was to do what my constituents want me to do. The legal structure, believe it or not, is another way to democratize bureaucracy. And so, if you take a look at the administrative law, for instance, that regulates government agencies, what it does is it provides for the intent of the laws that elected officials, and it gives lots of power to agencies and civil servants that aren't elected. So there's that. But those civil servants that aren't elected, they also have to follow the rules and standards set by the very government agencies that they are employed by. Now, the other legal guardrail is the court. And so, for example, you may have an administrative law, right? This example is an administrative law can challenge an act like NEPA, right? The National Environmental Policy Act. So, yes, someone can say, we're going to get rid of that law, the National Environmental Protective Act. But you can be sure and guaranteed that it's going to be met by a court challenge from one or more environmental groups, right? Because that ability to challenge the law is written in to the law. However, again, you see this back and forth constantly here. New administrations often try to, to shape a virtually guaranteed verdict through judicial appointments. And we can look at Roe v. Wade right now and see how that happens. The Supreme Court is the ultimate decision maker about law in the land if the case can get to the Supreme Court. So that is why appointments to the Supreme Court are so highly contested and political, right? Because if you can succeed in getting enough appointments that follow your ideologies, then they're almost guaranteed to come out the way you want them to come out. Okay. So what that means, what all of this means that we just talked about, is that this boring stuff of government bureaucracy really matters a lot. It really matters a lot. The Clean Air Act, with its rules and laws to regulate acid rain, for instance, and particulates, in the air, how many particulates, parts per million can there be? That's all part of administrative and bureaucratic systems. So, So in relation to the Clean Air Act, for instance, it does great stuff. That's part of the law and the bureaucracy. But to summarize, we can't be sure that the guardrails are going to work, because the only way they work is by citizen activists and advocacy organizations being watchdogs. You've heard that term, I'm sure, by organizations, watchdog and they're often grassroots watchdog organizations, they have to watch and make sure that the state is doing what it should do, or the agency, or the bureaucrats, right? That they're following the rules. So democracies know that the state isn't great at policing itself, is it? We all know that. Okay, that's not its forte, policing itself. So therefore, what happens is you have to make allowance from pressure from citizens. You have to make specific allowance in the law or in the administrative rules that citizens are allowed to have input and have a standing in court. Okay. Every major federal environmental law contains a citizen lawsuit provision. Okay. And that's to keep the government, quote, honest, even if only after the fact, even if it's only after they've not done something they should do, not followed an environmental law, for instance, then you can bring a lawsuit and hopefully fix that. So networks of trust, if we're talking about habits of the heart, then networks of trust are also important in this issue and figuring all this out. So cultivate knowledge with those you trust, a community, an organization, an attorney, who can tell you the actual facts of what's going on or of the situation or the problem. Because defending things of value in a democracy requires active involvement. Here's the main point about this. There's both a bottom and a top to effective change. We're the bottom, right? The top is all those people in Congress and, the CEOs of large companies and things of that nature, the billionaires. That's the top. We're the bottom. But it takes both in a democracy. And there's more of us than there are of them numerically. Once again, voting is just a number, but ultimately it comes down to a numbers game. Okay. And there can't be any question about, the only time there's a question about elections usually is if they're close. So think of all the people who feel the way you do about something and don't vote, So here we go, the bottom and the top. There's this interactiveness of the grassroots movements, that's the bottom, with the grass tops of the government, of the economy, technology, other social structures that govern daily life. That's the top, the grass top. Okay. So it's just another manifestation of this thing we've been talking about all term, which is a dialogue, the dialogue of the bottom and the top. But as we all know, even with a lot of grassroots effort, it seems, and it is, very top heavy, the whole system. The kind of fighting that goes on in Congress, et cetera, nothing gets done because it's blocked by something else. It's very top heavy. So in response, some advocates argue for a purely bottom up approach. Okay. But a purely bottom up approach faces lots of challenges. There are many local communities in the world, not just one. So whose voice are you going to listen to at the bottom, right? As the book says, the grassroots are plural. There's not just one voice. So if nothing else, that kind of pluralism, different ideas, different values, different beliefs, etc., it complicates coordination among groups. And on top of that, bottom-up activism requires lots of money and people and time, as we know. And the meetings of those organizations, depending on how together and functional they are, they might not happen very often. They could be very infrequent. They're not always well attended, and then when you get there, often there's, people don't, the citizen groups often don't have the expertise that's necessary to really put something into place to implement the required change, which is laws and regulations, et cetera. And then there's the problem of lack of political influence, okay? So those politics of contestation that we talked about can help a group gain face. In other words, a voice in the discussion, right? Can help people gain face. But wouldn't it be better if the top actively gave the bottom face, invited them to the discussion? Well, good luck about that. I mean, there are opportunities in hearings about laws, administrative rules, school board hearings, those types of things, where the bottom is invited to be heard. But, they're not terribly effective in many cases, et cetera. And the top would really prefer, anyway, that they weren't there, people, talking and asking them questions. And it's often very apparent in those kinds of meetings. So because of the potential, of that kind of potential, the top has a lot to offer the bottom, right? It could really welcome the bottom to participate and be part of the solution, but that rarely happens. It's kind of giving lip service, saying, well, we want to hear what you have to say, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that I've, for years at SWOC, and this is not uncommon in many colleges, most universities, is that the board of directors doesn't have any student representation on it. There's no elected board member from the student body. Well, it kind of tells you about hearing from the bottom, right? Okay. So the top, and I don't mean just at SWOC, we're talking about the top in general, whatever that is, could really encourage more participation and offer and support their resources, their expertise, coordination of rules, etc. So how can we get the top to get involved with the bottom in a productive, balanced, nonviolent, and just way, rather than just a conflictual one? Well, here's the key point. The top often, sometimes, also, I should say, sometimes needs the bottom, right? As much as the bottom does the top. Okay, I'm going to use SWOC again as an example, or any college or university as an example. What if there was a boycott of class? I mean, people can't do that. It's not probably a really good example because people need, you paid your money, you need to get your grades and go to class. But boycotts, things of that nature, can sometimes force the top into actually including the bottom in the discussion. Because one of the things that the top faces as a constant potential is that its legitimacy may be questioned, right? And it's called a legitimacy crisis. Are we not seeing that constantly today from every side of the political, every aspect of the political spectrum? There's a question about the legitimacy of government right now in the United States. So the top is always in constant need of justifying its authority. So it will sometimes work with the bottom, even if it's just to give the impression, right, that it really cares about the issue. So what's going on here? It's the dynamic of justice versus power, or justice and power. Maybe we shouldn't make it a versus. The dynamic of justice and power. For the bottom to have the power of justice, to be viewed as legitimate and have the power of justice, it needs the top. For the top to have just power, right, that the laws are just, the rules are just, etc., it needs the bottom, because the bottom is what provides legitimacy for the top. So they need each other, and it's a dialogue, actually. And once we figure that out, those of us on the bottom, that's very helpful because we see that we do have some power in the situation. But community is also involved, and the dialogue of the bottom and the top depends on solidarities. We've talked about solidarities previously. Groups of people who have common interests are what solidarities are, and our interests and our sentiments, because sentiments are involved with solidarities as well, and the power that comes from both our interests and our sentiments. So participatory democracy is the dialogue of the bottom and top. Well, that hasn't gone very well, has it? And we can look at that today. There are so many reasons. Certainly, participation is low, very low. So there's that. And so we have to find better ways to do this democracy, right? To make it work. We have to start to figure it out. So experience from those same kinds of efforts around the world, as you can imagine, there's been a lot of social science and political science research into how to have an effective democracy that's a real democracy, a true democracy. And what they found from the experience of people around the world in democracies is a common lesson. And the common lesson in all of the democracies that people have looked at, that researchers have looked at, is that the just ecological society requires more than the work of government in that narrow sense of the word. It requires the work of citizens as well. Okay. What that means is a shift from government as a top down, we make the rules, we make the laws, we impose those, we enforce those. So it means a shift from government to participatory government, where the people are involved in the government to a greater extent. So that's led to a whole new language, right? Certainly, we have participatory management, collaborative management, community-based management, and it goes on and on and on. There's a list of terminologies in the book to describe this idea of participatory governance of some kind or another. So if you look at how development worked in peripheral countries as an example, the local people were not consulted in early Peace Corps projects and a variety of other development organizations. Okay, so the early development had very, little respect for the views of the local people. And they kind of saw them just as backward and incapable of understanding the advantages of modern techniques, that type of thing. And it began to change in the early 1990s when participatory development began. And that involved local people as equal partners, leaders, and experts. Now, as you might imagine, that created a much greater sense of ownership and commitment, sentimental heart commitment to the project that was being done. And it ensured that, the project was more likely to do what the local people wanted it to do. And what that involved was this change in the development organizations to realize that the people they were trying to fix things for, from a Western perspective, for instance, Western scientific, technological perspective, actually had a lot of local knowledge that would be very, very, very useful in making the projects that they were working on, whether that was a water supply situation, agricultural farming situation, that including the people and their knowledge made the development projects not only much more efficient and better, but the buy-in from the people was important. Okay. But it doesn't always work out that well, right? With governing participation, right? So that the idea of governing participation is really crucial, as we've talked about. And we know that participatory governments can work because it's been done in so many other situations and places, like in development, as I just described, but it doesn't always work out well, really, on the ground when you get to governance. Okay. Because it can be very hard to get people to show up at meetings. Some people get very frustrated when they do show up because the group process isn't always very good, and there's misunderstandings that happen. And sometimes people walk out from those meetings being more at odds with each other than they were when they went to the meeting to try and solve problems. So, one of the things that has happened is that researchers over the years have developed guidelines for what are called best practices in how to run meetings for participatory processes, et cetera, to make sure that all voices are heard and welcome. I don't know if any of you have been to any meetings where there's a facilitator who makes sure that everybody gets heard and keeps things calmed down as much as possible. But that's a formal process, right? There's a kind of top-downness to it because there's a facilitator in charge. It's a formal process, and that doesn't necessarily fit with everybody's background and culture either. So it's very, very complicated. Formal procedures can stifle creativity. I'm sure you've experienced that at some meetings when somebody has some bright idea and everybody, then no, that won't work. We won't even discuss it. And so it's really how this can work too is that the facilitators can be hired by an organization or an entity that has a dog in the fight, right? So the example they give you in the book is 2008 in Britain, when the government wanted to bring nuclear power back. It had been banned in Britain. Nuclear power, people voted on it. They didn't want it. Okay. Now in 2008, the government wanted to bring it back, and it wound up that a scandal ensued out of that whole process because they had public meetings all over, Britain to see how people felt about it. And the consultant that was running the meetings was hired by the government, and the government wanted the plants and the nuclear power plants. And so the information that they gave, the way they ran the meetings, made it come out that the vast majority of people said that they wanted the plants. Well, when that came out, then they realized that the voting had been skewed by the way the meetings were being run. So how do we ground our knowledge? I like that terminology, grounding our knowledge. Okay. Well, there's something else happening in successful examples of participatory democracy. There's not only a dialogue of the bottom and the top, and including and especially local knowledge, which comes from the bottom, of course. But this other thing that's involved is the idea that problems start at the top. And it's true, that this is important, but there's more to it than just assuming that all the problems are up there. It's all those people in government, or it's all the company or the bosses or whatever. There's a lot of truth in it, but there's more going on than that, is the point. So the point is that just because something's called local knowledge or it comes from the bottom doesn't mean that there's no politics involved at that level, at the bottom, right? So it's very important, and they're using local knowledge here. Yeah, local knowledge is crucial, but it's one kind of knowledge that contributes to a solution, because the technological knowledge or the scientific knowledge is value, or the medical knowledge, that is scientific, but say medical knowledge, that's really important too. The local knowledge might tell you how to convince people or what their resistance is to certain medications, okay, or medical things in the developing world, but you still need the medical things. That's the scientific knowledge, okay? So it's important to have many types of knowledge intersecting to solve problems. And if you can, there's no problem that requires many types of knowledge more than environmental issues. That they really require interdisciplinary the environmental problems are very much interdisciplinary problems. So how do you address that in the most effective way? Because we all don't know it all, right? We all have a piece of knowledge and knowledges, pieces of them. So the answer is, how do you address this idea of grounded knowledge, of knowledge from different aspects? Is that the answer is that the participants have to situate their knowledge in their own experiences and perspectives in a way that they also link to the experiences and perspectives of others. Yes, we know this. Yes, this is our knowledge. Yes, this is our experience. That doesn't mean it's the only knowledge or the only experience, right? So if you really want to solve a problem, you have to understand that that's your reality, your knowledge, your experience. You have to grant that reality to other people and their knowledge and their experiences and their perspectives. So we're all different. Often we're really different, very different. And that means that we have a lot to learn from one another. That's what is called grounded knowledge, okay? It both situates you in your own knowledge, and it links by recognizing our own contributions and also our own limitations. Okay, that's grounded. That we recognize we have both contributions, information, and knowledge, but we all are also, in a way, limited by what we know. You know what I mean? So grounded knowledge, like local knowledge, is place-based. Okay? It's knowledge that knows and recognizes that it's place-based. Whether that place is a culture, a gender, a race, a degree, whatever, is place-based. And you have to know that that is place-based. You have to be able to recognize that in yourself. It also knows and appreciates that there are other places of knowledge, okay, with which you can connect if you're not so defensive about your own. And those places connecting to places and experiences to experience creates a dialogue. And maybe a new form of knowledge comes out of that dialogue. So whether you're a scientist or a farmer, your knowledge connects to the places from which it comes. Okay? Now, for many of us, that's our families, that's our religion, that's, whatever you get. It's the place we were raised. Were you raised in a very small town or a metropolis? That's going to change those places. I'm talking in that case, a physical place is going to very much change your knowledge and your experience and what seems real to you and valuable and important, all of those things. The key point is that everyone's knowledge matters, okay? But if a person thinks that their knowledge is all that matters, then there's no dialogue, right? You can't have a conversation or a discussion with someone if you're convinced that your knowledge is the only knowledge that matters, your information, okay? And as your text says, it's so beautifully put, what is democracy but a dialogue, right? You can't have a democracy without a dialogue either, without this give and take and understanding and discussion and granting others their knowledge, having your own knowledge respected, creating new knowledge, right? So if you look at, I put some Soulfire in a just ecological transition to, you know, that and farming. That's a video I put up for you, and they talk about Soulfire Farm in your book, of a new way of doing it, of using local knowledge and other knowledge and grounding it and actually creating something real. It's really a powerful process that you can read about in the text and see a short video. There's longer videos, of course, on YouTube about it. So finding your balance. In conclusion, there's some thoughts here and the aphorisms at the end of this chapter that are kind of interesting about what we've talked about. So aphorisms, you know, just short statements that really kind of succinctly put some of these ideas. The first one is just governance is more than just governance. Just governance, fair governance, in other words, is more than just governance. Okay. Ecological construction is not anti-construction. It is construction. It's not tearing things down. It's connecting. Bureaucracy can inspire inequality, yet equality can require bureaucracy. Only way you're going to get laws passed, laws equal bureaucracy for laws for equality, is by using that system, that bureaucratic system. So there's many others here. You can read them at the end of your book. I'm not going to go through them all. So I guess the final summation of this discussion is, do you want to go back to letting the top call all the shots? You know, we're having big arguments and discussions in this country right now about that. Probably you don't. Probably you don't want the top to call all the shots. Probably you would like to have your concerns considered, your ideas thought about, what you need, your needs, okay? So the only way to do that in a democracy is to participate. And you can do that through voting. You can do it through habits of the heart, which means your sentiments, your feelings, you know, having discussions with people. You can do it through the law, through participatory governance. If you're a boss at an organization, try some participatory governance, right? Rather than top down. And it can be done through local knowledge. And hopefully through this dialogue of everyday life, your everyday life, my everyday life, the 300 million people in the United States' everyday life, we can learn a bit more about how to get along with each other and with the earth, most importantly right now. Although maybe they're both equally important, I think, because we're not going to get along with each other if we don't get along with the earth, and vice versa. And I've created an aphorism. There you go.